On Christmas Eve, when bells were meant to ring with mercy, her world was torn apart by iron hands and cold signatures. They dragged her children one way, her husband another, and called it law. What they didn't know was that grief can sharpen into something deadlier than chains, because on that same holy night, a mother made a vow in blood, and one by one, every master who signed a family's destruction would learn what justice looks like when it has nothing left to lose. The plantation existed long before the bloodshed, long before whispers of revenge ever crept through its fields, standing as a carefully constructed world of dominance and submission where cruelty wore the mask of normalcy. From the outside, it appeared orderly, almost peaceful, with wide porches, whitewashed fences, and rows of crops stretching toward the horizon like symbols of prosperity. But beneath that calm surface lived a system built on calculated suffering, where every sunrise marked another day of ownership over human lives, and every sunset confirmed that escape was still a distant dream. Families were permitted only when they served efficiency. A man, a woman, children, together they worked harder, resisted less, and cost less to manage. Love was not acknowledged as a right, but tolerated as a temporary arrangement, something that could be undone at any moment with ink on paper and the clink of coins. Mothers taught their children to memorize faces, because tomorrow those faces might vanish. Husbands and wives learned to speak affection softly, knowing walls had ears and happiness attracted punishment. The masters called it structure. They believed discipline kept the plantation alive. That fear was as essential as water and soil. Overseers enforced rules with whips and boots, ensuring that pain remained predictable and therefore manageable. Any deviation was corrected publicly, not to punish the individual alone, but to remind everyone watching that resistance carried a price far greater than obedience. Even laughter had to be measured, even silence observed, because both could be interpreted as defiance. At night, when the fields finally rested, the enslaved gathered in fragile pockets of darkness, sharing stories passed down through generations. These stories were not just comfort, they were survival. They spoke of ancestors stolen from lands across the ocean, of spirits that watched over the broken, of freedom that existed somewhere beyond the stars. The masters dismissed these gatherings as harmless superstition, never realizing that memory itself was a weapon they could not confiscate. Children grew up learning the rhythms of labor before they learned to read faces properly. They learned when to lower their eyes, when to speak, when to disappear into stillness. Childhood ended early, replaced by endurance. Yet even here, humanity persisted stubbornly. Mothers braided hope into their daughters' hair. Fathers taught sons how to stand tall without appearing proud. Small acts of love survived, hidden between tasks, exchanged in glances too quick to punish. The woman at the center of this story lived within these rules for years. She worked, obeyed, endured. She built a family in the narrow space allowed to her, believing, perhaps foolishly, that loyalty and productivity might protect what she loved. Her children slept beside her at night, her husband's presence a fragile anchor in a world designed to erase bonds. She knew the risk, but hope is a quiet rebellion, and she clung to it because letting go meant surrendering her last piece of self. The plantation thrived on that hope, feeding on it, exploiting it. The masters understood that people who loved had more to lose, and therefore more to fear. They allowed families to grow just long enough to make separation devastating. It was not cruelty born of impulse, but of strategy. By the time Christmas approached, the plantation stood calm and profitable, its ledger balanced, its fields harvested. Its owners convinced that nothing within their domain could ever turn against them. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in false warmth, the kind that looked gentle from a distance, but burned when touched. The air carried the scent of pine and smoke, and the plantation dressed itself in the illusion of mercy, as if tradition alone could cleanse what it was built upon. Bells rang in the distance. Laughter spilled from the main house, and the masters spoke of generosity while preparing to commit acts that would echo through generations of pain. That morning began like any other, with orders shouted and labor assigned, but beneath the routine moved an undercurrent of tension. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps, carrying rumors of sales and debts that needed settling before the year ended. Christmas, for the masters, was not only a celebration but an accounting, a time to balance books and cut losses. Human lives were weighed against numbers, measured for their value rather than their breadth. By afternoon, the truth emerged without ceremony. Names were called, not with kindness but with authority sharp enough to draw blood. Her husband's name came first. He was to be sold south, far from the land he knew, to a plantation where survival itself was uncertain. The announcement was delivered as if it were weather, unavoidable and indifferent. She stood frozen, the sound of her own heartbeat louder than the overseer's voice. Then came the children, one by one. They were assigned to different buyers, their ages and strengths discussed openly, their futures decided in seconds. A child's cry interrupted the transaction, but it was silenced quickly, not with comfort but with force. The masters did not look away. They never did. To them, tears were noise and noise was inconvenient. She was allowed no farewell, no embrace long enough to matter. Hands tore her family from her reach as if they were objects misplaced. Chains replaced touch. Words of reassurance died in her throat, useless against men who considered compassion a weakness. Around her, other enslaved families watched in helpless horror, knowing tomorrow could be theirs. As evening settled, the plantation transformed into a scene of celebration. Candles were lit, tables filled, and hymns sung about peace and goodwill. The cruelty of the day was buried beneath food and drink, laughter echoing through halls built by stolen labor. Outside, in the quarters, silence reigned. Grief had no language left to use. She sat alone as night fell, the cold seeping into her bones, replaying every moment she had failed to stop. Her mind searched desperately for an answer that did not exist, for a mercy that had already been denied. The world she had endured for years collapsed in a single day, revealing itself not as harsh but as deliberately monstrous. Something changed in her during those hours. The pain did not soften with tears, it sharpened. Memory carved itself into her thoughts. Every face involved in the transaction burned into her mind. The laughter from the main house drifted across the fields like an insult, sealing what had been done. Christmas Eve, meant to honor birth and redemption, became the night her faith in mercy died, and something darker took its place. The night after the separation did not pass like a normal night. Time stretched and twisted, refusing to move forward, trapping her in the space between what had been taken and what still breathed inside her chest. She did not sleep. Sleep belonged to people who could afford to dream. She sat in the dark, listening to the plantation settle, counting footsteps, counting breaths, counting the distance between her and everything she had lost. Tears came first, heavy and uncontrollable, shaking her body until it hurt to breathe. But tears are exhausting, and eventually they stop asking permission. When they dried, they left something raw behind, something exposed and burning. In that emptiness, her grief began to change its shape. It no longer begged. It no longer pleaded. It hardened, pulling inward, folding itself into something sharp enough to cut. She replayed the day again and again, not as memory, but as study. Every word spoken by the masters. Every glance exchanged between overseers. The way contracts were signed without hesitation. The way laughter followed suffering, as if it were part of the same ritual. She realized then that what had happened was not chaos or cruelty born of impulse. It was intention, and intention could be answered. Her mind began to organize itself around names. Not just faces, but patterns. Who drank too much? Who wandered alone at night? Who trusted locks instead of awareness? Who believed power made them untouchable? She stored these details carefully, not with urgency, but with patience. Rage without direction would only get her killed. She needed something quieter, something that could survive. In the following days, she became exactly what the plantation expected her to be. Obedient, silent, useful. She lowered her eyes more often. She spoke less. She worked harder. Pain was no longer something she reacted to. It was something she absorbed without sound. The masters mistook this for submission, never questioning why grief had not destroyed her like it did others. Inside, something else was growing. A vow. Unspoken but absolute. She would not beg for reunion. She would not pray for mercy from men who had none to give. If her family had been scattered by deliberate hands, then deliberate hands would be the answer. This was not about anger alone. It was about balance. About returning weight to a world that had crushed her without consequence. At night, she practiced remembering without breaking. She trained herself to hold images of her children without collapsing, to think of her husband without screaming into the dark. Pain became fuel, measured and controlled. She understood that survival was no longer enough. Survival without justice was just another form of slow death. She listened more closely now. Walls talked when people believed they were safe. Drunken voices revealed secrets. Careless boasts exposed weaknesses. She learned where fear lived and, more importantly, where it did not. The masters believed fear only flowed in one direction. That belief made them careless. What had been taken from her could not be returned by kindness or time. But something else could be reclaimed. Agency. Choice power. Not the kind written into laws or owned by land, but the kind that moves quietly unseen until it is too late to stop. By the time the plantation noticed the change in her eyes, the vow had already rooted itself too deeply to be undone. Becoming invisible was not an act of surrender, but a skill learned through observation and discipline. She understood that the plantation thrived on predictability, on knowing who feared whom and how far obedience could be pushed. To disappear within that system, she had to become unremarkable, blending so perfectly into routine that no one bothered to truly see her. Invisibility, she realized, was a kind of freedom disguised as weakness. She adjusted her movements first. No sudden gestures. No hesitation that might draw attention. Every task was completed with steady precision, neither too slow to invite punishment, nor too fast to suggest ambition. She positioned herself where eyes slid past without focus, where her presence registered as function rather than person. The masters liked efficiency, not curiosity, and she gave them exactly that. Listening became her most valuable tool. Conversations carried on freely around those who were assumed powerless. She learned which overseers argued with their wives, which masters drank themselves into carelessness, which guards preferred comfort over duty. Words spilled easily when no one believed they were being collected. She stored every detail without reaction, allowing information to pile up quietly inside her like dry wood waiting for a spark. At night, she tested the boundaries of the plantation in small, careful ways. She memorized the sounds each building made after dark, the creak of boards, the soft complaints of hinges, the silence that meant danger. She noted which dogs could be distracted, which were too loyal to approach. She learned how shadows moved across the land with the moon, where darkness pooled thick enough to hide a body or a blade. Pain became another lesson. Blisters, bruises. Hunger, these were no longer distractions but reminders of why she endured. She trained herself to accept discomfort without flinching, to keep her face neutral even when her body screamed. Reaction, she understood, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every visible emotion was information she could not give away. The masters continued their lives with careless confidence. They laughed loudly, drank deeply, and spoke of business as if nothing beneath them could ever reach up. Their routines never changed. That was their greatest weakness. Power had convinced them that danger only came from rebellion, from noise, from crowds. They did not fear the quiet worker who kept her head down and her hands busy. Trust began to work in her favor. She was sent on errands alone. She was allowed near storage rooms, kitchens, and stables without supervision. Familiarity bred neglect. Keys were left within reach. Doors remained unlocked longer than they should have. The plantation was teaching her its vulnerabilities, offering them freely in exchange for her silence. Inside, her patience deepened. She did not rush the moment. She waited, knowing that the right time was not something seized, but something allowed to ripen. Every day she survived unnoticed was another day closer to action. In becoming invisible, she had gained access to a world the masters believed belonged only to them, and they never realized that what they could not see had already learned how to move among them without permission. The first death was not sudden in her mind, even if it appeared that way to everyone else. It had been rehearsed endlessly in thought, examined from every angle, stripped of impulse and hesitation. She understood that once the first line was crossed, there would be no return to the person she had been. That understanding did not stop her. It steadied her. Fear lost its power when the worst had already happened. He was not the highest master, nor the cruelest in reputation, but he had been present on Christmas Eve. He had signed the paper without looking up. He had joked afterward, glass raised, voice loud. That was enough. Guilt was not measured by rank, but by participation. He lived alone in a smaller house on the edge of the property, a place where confidence replaced caution and locks were more symbolic than real. She watched him for days without urgency. She learned the rhythm of his evenings, the hour he drank himself slow, the way he dismissed servants early, believing solitude made him powerful. Night after night, she walked past his house, as if it were nothing more than another shadow on the land, counting steps, memorizing angles, listening to the sound of his breathing through open windows. The night she chose was quiet, heavy with cloud, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. She did not feel dramatic or wild. Her hands were steady. Her thoughts were narrow and clear. This was not about hatred in that moment. It was about completion, about answering an act that had been carried out without remorse. The world did not shift when she crossed the threshold. Floors creaked as expected. The air smelled of stale drink and smoke. He lay exactly where she knew he would be, unaware that the distance between power and vulnerability was only a few steps wide. When it was over, there was no scream loud enough to travel far, no struggle long enough to matter. Death arrived quickly, without ceremony, just as he had delivered destruction to her family. She did not linger. Lingering was for people who needed confirmation. She already knew what had been done. She left the house as quietly as she had entered, closing the door behind her, returning to the night that had hidden her approach. The plantation slept on, untouched by the shift that had just occurred beneath its surface. Morning brought confusion instead of clarity. His death was discovered late, discussed in fragments, explained away with words like accident and misfortune. The masters preferred explanations that did not threaten their sense of control. An investigation was mentioned but never taken seriously. It was easier to believe in bad luck than to accept that the balance had begun to change. She watched the reactions carefully. The fear was subtle at first, flickering behind eyes, buried under forced laughter. No one suspected her. That was the most important lesson of all. The first death had not exposed her. It had exposed them. Their certainty cracked quietly, and into that crack, something dangerous had begun to grow. She felt no relief, no joy, no sudden peace. Instead, there was a calm recognition that this was only the beginning. One death did not reunite a family. One death did not dismantle a system. It simply proved that the masters were not untouchable, and once that truth existed, it could not be erased. Fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the plantation slowly, like dampness creeping up from the ground, unnoticed until it had already soaked through the walls. At first, the masters spoke of the death with forced calm, insisting it was an isolated event, an unfortunate accident that required no deeper thought. They repeated this story to one another as much as to everyone else, hoping repetition would turn it into truth. But routines began to fracture. Doors that had once been left open were now locked. Servants were questioned more sharply. Overseers slept lighter, waking at the smallest sound. Confidence, once worn openly, retreated into nervous habits. Men who had never looked over their shoulders before now did so instinctively, as if something unseen had learned how to follow. Rumors replaced certainty. Some whispered that rival plantations were involved, that business disputes had turned violent. Others blamed rebellious spirits, refusing to say the word slave out loud, as if naming the possibility might invite it closer. No one imagined the threat stood within their daily routines, listening quietly, moving freely, unchallenged. Another death followed, spaced just far enough apart to feel unrelated, yet close enough to reopen the wound of fear. This time it was an overseer, found lifeless near the stables, the smell of poison still sharp in the air. Panic surged harder now. Overseers were meant to be the enforcers, the shield between ownership and resistance. If they could fall, then the illusion of control was already broken. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Voices rose, then fell. Accusations passed between men who had once trusted each other without question. Old alliances strained under suspicion. Each master believed someone else might be responsible, someone with motive, someone with reason. They searched outward, never inward, blind to the truth that power itself had made them careless. The enslaved watched silently as fear reshaped the plantation. Work slowed. Punishments grew erratic, driven more by anxiety than discipline. Cruelty, once calculated, became sloppy. Mistakes were made. Guards missed shifts. Keys went missing. In trying to tighten their grip, the masters loosened it, creating gaps they could no longer see clearly. She moved through this growing chaos untouched by suspicion. Her invisibility held. If anything, she was trusted more, valued for her consistency in a time when everyone else seemed unstable. She absorbed the tension without reacting, allowing fear to travel around her like wind around stone. Each new death reinforced the belief that the danger was external, distant, beyond reach. The plantation began to turn on itself. Men argued over security measures, over who should be armed, over who was responsible for what. Sleep deprivation made tempers short. Alcohol flowed more freely, dulling judgment further. The very tools they used to escape fear made them more vulnerable to it. Every reaction taught her something. Fear revealed habits more honestly than comfort ever could. She learned who panicked and who pretended not to, who isolated themselves, who sought protection in numbers, who believed prayer alone could shield them. The plantation was no longer a single system of control, but a fractured body, each part acting independently, unaware that fragmentation only made it easier to dismantle. By the time the masters understood that something was hunting them, they still did not understand what it was. They believed in threats they could name, faces they could imagine, enemies who looked like resistance. They could not conceive of justice moving quietly, patiently, through the very structure that had once made them feel invincible. As the plantation unraveled, she began to understand that destruction alone would not reunite what had been torn apart. Death created fear, but fear by itself did not restore stolen lives. What mattered were the records, the rotes, the agreements hidden in desks and ledgers that mapped where people had been sent, and who now claimed ownership of them. The system that sold her family relied on paperwork as much as chains, and paper burned just as easily. She targeted those who knew where the records were kept. Traders who boasted of their reach. Clerks who believed ink made them powerful. Each encounter stripped another layer of protection away from the structure that had scattered her family. Fires broke out in storage rooms. Documents vanished overnight. Names were erased from books that had once sealed fates. Confusion spread as transactions lost their proof, and claims of ownership began to collapse under their own weight. With each disruption, opportunities appeared. Transport schedules were delayed. Buyers argued over missing documentation. Patrols were reassigned to protect property instead of watching people. In that chaos, some of the enslaved were moved back, others lost track of entirely, slipping through gaps that had never existed before. Freedom did not arrive cleanly or completely, but cracks widened, and through those cracks survival found space. She followed every rumor, every whisper of movement that hinted at her children or her husband. Sometimes the news was wrong. Sometimes it arrived too late. Each truth carried its own wound, reopening grief she had learned to control. But control did not mean numbness. Pain remained constant, a reminder of why she continued even when hope faltered. When she finally found one of her children, it was not the reunion she had imagined in quieter dreams. The child was thinner, older in the eyes, carrying the weight of separation in silence. There were no tears at first, only disbelief, hands hovering as if afraid to confirm what was real. They held each other without speaking, surrounded by the aftermath of fear and flight, knowing that joy and sorrow could exist in the same breath. Others did not come back alive. That truth followed her like a shadow. Every master involved carried responsibility, not just for separation, but for what happened afterward. Neglect, violence, death. The system had not simply scattered her family, it had destroyed parts of it beyond repair. That knowledge hardened her resolve further, stripping away any remaining hesitation. By the time the last of the masters involved began to disappear, the plantation was no longer a place of order. It was a scarred landscape of burned buildings, missing men, and unanswered questions. Ownership became meaningless when no one could enforce it. The remaining masters fled or fortified themselves, clinging to power that had already slipped through their fingers. She moved through the wreckage with purpose, not triumph. This was not victory as songs described it. It was reclamation, incomplete and costly. She had not restored what was lost, but she had ended the hands that destroyed it. The system that believed it could separate families without consequence now lay fractured, unable to remember its own strength. When she vanished, there were no witnesses who could say when or how. Some claimed she escaped north with those she had recovered. Others believed she disappeared into the forests, carrying ghosts with her. What remained was not a body or a confession, but the absence of those who had believed themselves untouchable, and the knowledge that even the most brutal systems could bleed when they forgot the humanity they tried so hard to erase. Long after the plantation collapsed into rumor and ash, the story refused to disappear. It traveled the way forbidden truths always do, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, reshaped by fear and memory. No official record carried her name. No document confirmed her actions. The masters who survived preferred silence, because silence allowed them to pretend nothing had ever threatened their world. Among the enslaved, the story changed depending on who told it. Some spoke of her as a mother driven beyond the limits of endurance. Her love sharpened into something unrecognizable. Others described her as a spirit of reckoning, a presence that moved through shadows when justice failed to arrive any other way. Details shifted, faces blurred, but the core remained the same. A woman whose family was taken. A system that believed itself untouchable. A reckoning that proved otherwise. Children grew up hearing warnings wrapped in bedtime whispers. Not all chains are visible. Not all danger announces itself. Power that forgets consequences invites its own end. The story was never told loudly, never celebrated openly. It lived in poises, in lowered voices, in the way elders glanced toward the dark before continuing. Memory was both shield and burden. The remaining masters dismissed the tale as exaggeration, superstition, rebellion inflated into myth. They insisted the disappearances were coincidence, the fires accidents, the fear misplaced. But their behavior betrayed them. They changed routes, they fortified homes. They trusted less, slept lighter, and never again felt fully alone even in locked rooms. The legend had altered them whether they admitted it or not. Years passed, and the land tried to forget. Crops grew again. Buildings were rebuilt. New owners claimed authority over the same soil, believing history reset with paperwork and profit. But land remembers. Places where blood was spilled never fully returned to silence. Workers avoided certain paths after sunset. Dogs barked at empty air. The night felt heavier in places where men once believed themselves gods. No one ever confirmed what became of her. Some swore she crossed borders and vanished into anonymity, carrying the weight of what she had done like a second skin. Others believed she never left, that she became part of the land itself, her story embedded in its unease. The truth dissolved into possibilities, each one shaped by the needs of those who repeated it. What endured was not her face or her voice, but the disruption she caused. She forced a system to confront the cost of its cruelty, not through appeal or rebellion, but through consequence. She demonstrated that power maintained through fear could be dismantled by it. That lesson lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved. The legend was never meant to inspire comfort. It offered no clean resolution, no sense of balance restored. It existed as a reminder that when humanity is stripped away repeatedly and deliberately, what emerges in its place may not look like mercy. Justice, when denied too long, can take forms that unsettle even those who benefit from it. In the end, her story survived because it answered a question people were afraid to ask. What happens when the oppressed stop waiting for permission to matter? What happens when loss is answered not with silence, but with action? The plantation fell, the masters vanished, and history was left with a space it could not neatly explain, a shadow shaped like a woman who refused to let Christmas Eve be the last night her family mattered.